So you're probably thinking, when is she actually going to talk about the play? And I do really want to, because it is gripping and full of juicy, beautiful language that we can look at. So let's talk about the play, but more dates. Let's begin by talking about the stages in its life and what it took for us to have this piece of art as a playtext. So Buchner, as you would already be aware, died horribly young in 1837. Now, he had already done 3 drafts of Woyzeck, along with a number of other writings, including 2 other plays. But he was working on the 4th draft of this particular play, and he wrote to his fiancée that he would have this plus 2 other plays ready to be published, quote, in less than a week. So we know that he was working on this play text right up to his death, but also that he'd revised it a number of times and had kind of got it into a form that he was ready to share. So that was 1837 that happened. Now, of course, it didn't have time to get published then. So it took until 1850 for Buchner's brothers to gather his papers together, and they sort of compiled them so there would be a record of his complete works, but they didn't actually publish them. So you've got to bear in mind that still at this stage, 1850, no one had copies of this play at all. Now then, someone else came in and took over and gradually began publishing Buchner's work, including his philosophical work, and various pieces of writing, until by 1880, the whole lot had been published, including Woyzeck as part of a kind of larger compendium of complete works. Now, this is when we get this gap of more than 30 years, because the play was now available in circulation. It was in print, you could get it and read it. But still, it wasn't treated as something that anyone was going to try performing until the German director, producer, theatre manager Max Reinhardt and his company in Munich took it on in 1913. Now, by then, we are deep into the German Expressionist movement. So theatre had completely changed its generic conventions by the time this was performed. Now, there's always a lag of just a couple of years generally between when a play gets lots of attention and when someone turns it into an opera. That was a pretty conventional pattern by this point. And so in 1925, we get the Alban Berg opera, and that is a marvelously dark piece, but you can see from Woyzeck that it does have those kinds of it has a story shape of opera, hinging on grand passion, madness, and murder, even if it applies to people who are a lot less lofty in their positions in life than many operas of the previous century. So that was 1925. There'd been I was about to say many, maybe that's an exaggeration. There have been a number of filmic interpretations and versions since then. I think probably the best known would be Werner Herzog's 1979 version, and there's an image of that on the screen there. However, there was also a Hungarian version in the 90s, which garnered quite a lot of attention. And I'll be telling you when I get on to talking about the play's performance history in more detail and its afterlives. That's a word I always like to use to describe the way it's like it's more than just a series of productions of plays. Plays go on to be other things, and that's why afterlives is such a useful term. But I will talk to you about the Robert Wilson, Tom Waits, Kathleen Brennan version, Blood Money, which is from our own century that we are currently in. So yes, just to recap there, this is a slide that you saw in the previous video, but I just wanted to show you how it slots in with this timeline of when it was written, when it was published, and when it was eventually performed. So the German expressionist movement in theatre, we almost had to have that happen before any theatre practitioners were able to look at this text and go, yes, I can see this as a piece of theatre that works where we are. So yes, that was the 1913 production then. So the dramaturgy of this play. So dramaturgy is a word we kick around a lot to talk about the construction and structure of the play, of a play text. You might say that it's the architecture of a play. It's the building shape of it. You can also refer to dramaturgy as meaning any aspect of theatrical production that relates to the text, or any aspect of a text that relates to its role in being a performed piece. So that is what dramaturgy is. But let's talk about the truly remarkable dramaturgy of this 1837 play. For a long time after it was published, people kind of treated it as if it was a fragment, an unfinished work, because it just so completely failed to conform to what other play texts looked like in 1837. And so the word around it was, oh, it's the first example of open theatre. It's scenes that could be moved around in their order, or it just is unfinished. Buchner would have turned it into a more conventional dramaturgical arc or shape if he'd kept working on it. I think that those perceptions of the play are misguided. I think that the fact that Buchner wrote just in the week before his death that this play would be finished and ready for publication within no more than the next week shows that he was ready to put it out into the world in the shape that it currently has. And I will go into the details of the breakdown of the scenes a little more in a moment. But first of all, I just want us to think about how neat a piece it really is when you do assume that it was finished and was meant to be presented in these terms. It's incredible shortness is one of the first things that will strike you, because we're talking about the 19th century. Theatre had got big and it had got convoluted, and people were willing to sit in the theatre for a long time. And this is really a play that is only about half the length of a standard average play that was published or performed at the time this play was written. We're much less tolerant of long nights in the theatre now on the whole. So now it's a perfectly appropriate length for a modern theatre, but very, very short for something in the 19th century. Yes, the scenes are on the surface disjointed. You jump from one to the other, and if you lifted one out, it could be performed independently without realizing that something was wrong, that it hadn't followed on immediately from the one immediately before. So that is remarkable too. Yes, we don't always see the steps going through. This happens and that causes the next thing and that causes the next thing. But having said that, when you look at the shape overall, thematically and psychologically, the links are profoundly obvious. Yes, we may suddenly end up in a fair where there is a funfair barker talking about an intelligent horse, but looking at the thematic content of the play, this tension between the lofty and the bestial, between mind, spirit, and body, between compulsive nature and this idea that people like the Doctor have, that you can somehow impose and regulate humanity and discipline on people. I remember the two scenarios we see Woyzeck in, apart from his home life, are his role in the army. So this idea of taking men and making them regulated and regimented, and yet somehow managing to make them more bestial. That is one theme there. And also his times with the Doctor, where the Doctor is again trying to impose ideas of control and discipline and being an advanced human being, while putting Woyzeck through torments that are almost certain to render him just the opposite of that. So yes, cause and effect and dramaturgical sequence of scenes are not always completely obvious, but thematically they make so much sense. The image on the screen there is from the Robert Wilson production from 2002. You can see it is highly stylized there, and I will compare it with a couple of other versions as we go. The image on this slide here, that is from it's still the Robert Wilson, Kathleen Brennan, Tom Waits adaptation, but it was a later production, 2009, and I think you can see a very different aesthetic here. It is trying to make the people look profoundly ordinary compared, but they're not trying to look like works of art like in this version. They're looking like ordinary people, and I wonder if there was an impulse there to reconnect with the humanity of the characters. So let's talk about dramaturgy and Buchner's process in writing this. 4 drafts are extant. However, number 3 is kind of patchy, it's sort of notes, fragmented pieces, and quite difficult to read. But Buchner wrote in a letter to his fiancée that his 4th version would be finished in a week at most. Now, the manuscripts are usually referred to as H1 through to H4. H4, so that's the one Buchner was working at his death, does have very coherent and polished and complete scenes all the way up to 17, but then ends there. So it makes perfect sense to treat that segment as the beginning of the play. And then editors now are tending to then take the original draft manuscript H1 and use it to then drop in those final scenes 18 to 25. And when you do that, you have a complete and coherent script. And the events taking place are not haphazard, and they aren't move around however you see fit, and it doesn't make a difference at all. They follow a very tight trajectory. The first 3 scenes take place in the evening, and we open there with Woyzeck with his colleague from his compatriot from the army, Andreas, and they are on an assignment. And immediately, right at the very beginning there, what you get is an expression from Woyzeck of his deteriorating mental state. We can see right away that things are not right with him, and that it's to do with how he responds to the world around him. He's seeing things that are not there, hearing things that are not there. So the setup for the plot is right there in that first scene. Then scenes 4 to 8 happen the next morning, 9 to 12 that afternoon, and then that night. And then we get 1 more days of activity before he murders Marie in the early evening of the following day. So really a very tightly plotted trajectory. If you piece the play together from what H4 gives us, and then taking what seems most coherent from H1. But what we have here is 25 very short scenes that show us, and Woyzeck's in almost all of them. There's a couple that are just Marie, but he's in most of them. And we see a rapid deterioration of his state that we can connect very easily to the pressures put on him physically and societally, by mostly in regard to his work, and of course also in his relationship with Marie. But I think in the end, this isn't a jealous rage he kills her in. Yes, there are the usual anxieties about the potential for female sexual incontinence that frankly we've been seeing in pretty much every play we study. But the actual impulse to the brutality that he comes to seems to come much more from the suffering imposed by people who have more power than him, not from Marie, who in so many ways has even less power. But anyway, dramaturgy, coherent 25 short scenes, very tightly written play and very concise. And that is why I've got a quote here from Michael Billington, who was the chief critic at The Guardian for many years, saying, this is the first truly modern play. And I don't think he's overstating that there. He says it's the first truly modern play in that it argues our lives are determined by social and environmental circumstance. Now, I don't know if it's the only play from that period to do that, but I do think, given that it took another couple of decades for realism and realism as a form of activism in theatre to kick in, I do feel like it's almost the first activist play, the first socially activist play, because a century before Brecht, this guy was wanting his audience to see something that is likely to really happen to a person who is living in brutally impoverished circumstances, and to feel outraged by it, and to feel that this is a thing that needs to be fixed. And we're so much more used to associating those principles of activism in theatre with Brecht, who was taking up that mantle basically 100 years later. So yes, let's talk about the revolutionary conceptualizing of this play as a tragedy, but not a tragedy of kings and heroes, a tragedy of the working class, the first working class tragedy. Woyzeck is as low as you can be in the social rankings and still be employed. He hasn't even had the chance to marry his woman, and they don't have the opportunity to have the kind of home life that is seen as desirable or healthy. None of the characters, even the ones with more power in this play, like the doctor or the captain, none of them are important people. We have no generals here. We have no masters, no heroes. Everyone is from the ordinary people, just struggling within their own groups for enough, to get up the ladder a little bit to have enough. And so those circumstances, that it's so obvious to us how that would give rise to tragedy in the sense of inevitable downfall because of the flaws. This is very new as an idea, that these flaws are within society that is imposing too great a burden on a working class person. But Buchner was drawing on medical reports, newspaper reports of things that were happening. So yes, as always, working class people were breaking at this time. And so it's kind of marvelous to finally see that recognized on stage. Woyzeck explores the reasons for his violence to Marie, and it doesn't stop. as being as simple as sexual jealousy. There's much more going on. There's material impoverishment, social status, the stress, the undeniable ongoing stress of living in this underclass, and the fact that that is what is going to result in his mental state, mental derangement. And so let's go back to talking about how this discussion, how this is a discussion of genre. It's a discussion of the fact that, yes, this play is a tragedy, but it's a tragedy of a different kind. It's a working class tragedy, but it is also an activist piece, an indictment of social systems. So it sets up the potential for new genres to do with agitprop theatre, with socialist theatre, with working class theatre. And at the same time, now this is my personal little pitch on this, I believe that it also, well, the means that it finds to do this. So, of course, with dramaturgy, you're talking about the story, but you're also talking about the means of telling the story. How do we go about, what's the execution? How do we go about telling this story? I think that Buchner does harken back to certain medieval aspects here. The idea, you notice there's the figure of the fool in the play, who on the surface doesn't seem to fit, doesn't seem to generate anything to do with the plot. But I think what he brings in is the medieval idea, prominent idea of the holy fool, the idea that in the fool you can see the vision of what is simple in society, but also perhaps what is wrong in society. So yes, the concept of the holy fool, the concept of the carnivalesque, the concept of inversion of status, the idea that here we are down in the mud with the working class people, this idea of grotesquerie, where tragedy is warped until it's almost comic. It's a very medieval idea, and I mentioned Rabelais and also Bakhtin. So those are names you might want to look up if that idea interests you and you want to look more closely into the idea of how grotesquerie can be a medieval concept that was useful in later theatrical circles for the purposes of social activism. Oh, there's a whole course to be done in that. But let's just simplify things a little bit there and just look thematically at this play again. You'll notice there's an awful lot of dichotomies here. There are tensions between one thing on one side and another on the other. Tragedy, but working class. Social pressure, mental degeneration and madness. We are looking at the question of what is inherently grotesque or violent or dark within humanity versus is it environment that causes that to come out, to emerge? So nature versus environment there. Free will versus determinism. Is it inevitable that such tragedy must happen, or is it possible to divert the path from that? What will cause the potential to divert the path? Does it have to be a change in society, or can an individual make a difference? Do we hope or do we despair in this situation? Is our impulse to violence located in what is inherent in us or what is imposed on us from outside? So my point about in summary, about the dramaturgy of this play is that it looks ahead to activist theatre, to socialist theatre, to working class theatre, to ideas that theatre could be an agent for change. But in order to do that, Buchner activated, made use of what was available to him, which were traditions of grotesquerie, dark carnival, holy fools, the medieval exaggeration and caricature, and the idea that you can take tragedy and twist it to make it into what you believe your theatre audience needs to see today. So now we've got to that point about talking about how this translates onto the stage, these ideas, these philosophical ideas about what we need to think about in our society. The next video will be on the two things, the afterlife, so the performance aspects of the play, but also how you can go ahead and analyze the convergence of all these points, how you can write about how such ideas translate into performance.